Hey there nerds, my name's Moy McTeer and this is Reverse Worldbuilding, the show for people who wish mythology had just a little bit more science in it. Usually in these videos I take a mythological or legendary figure and I imagine what type of planet they could have realistically evolved on given their characteristics, but I'm gonna do something a little bit different this time. If you've been paying any attention to the news, then you probably know that this has been a really tough week for Black people in the US, and one thing that I've seen a lot of on my Twitter newsfeed at least is a lot of debates about whether or not there are good cops. So I like the idea that the word myth can be used broadly, and so in this video I'm going to be discussing the myth of the good cop. Let me first take a moment to say that I, of course, know that there are individual police officers who do good things and have good intentions, but when intelligent, thoughtful, well-meaning people say things like all cops are bad, what they mean, or at least what I mean, is that the institution of policing is based on a faulty foundation. To understand that, you have to actually look at the history of how the police force was established in the US, because it wasn't something that was guaranteed. So one of the first publicly funded police forces was put together in the 1800s in Boston, actually, because wealthy businessmen needed security guards to protect their property. And they convinced the local government that it would be a good for the community if they would publicly fund security officers or police officers to protect their valuable assets. In other parts of the country, like the South, policing had an even darker origin story. The original police force, a sort of widespread, organized, standardized, and well-funded police force was put together to capture runaway slaves, and then after emancipation it was kept around to enforce segregation and then to enforce Jim Crow era regulations and laws and public sentiment. And so if you look at how the police force came to be in America, you can see that it's built on a foundation of violence and racism and valuing and prioritizing property. Of course, we can say that the goals of policing have changed since then, and for many police officers they have, but you can still see remnants of this origin baked into how we train police officers here in the US. If you compare how we train police officers here in the US to how they do it in other parts of the world, it's amazing how lopsided the parts of training are. I read a report that if you break down the number of hours that police officers spend practicing different skills, they spend 110 hours working on firearm skills and self-defense. And they spend just 8 hours working on conflict resolution and management. That is so incredibly lopsided, and if you look at the ways that other countries train their police officers, you can see that it's much more balanced. They spend more time focusing on conflict resolution, they spend more time training police officers that using a firearm is a last stage of defense. It's the last thing that you should possibly do. So all of that is to say that I do understand that there are individual police officers who do good things and mean well, but they are working in this institution, they're working in this machine that doesn't have the best origins and doesn't have the best training modules, and so they are working in a mindset that leads to bad outcomes. And that's why we see so many, or that's one of the reasons why we see so many instances of police violence and police brutality, especially against Black and brown people here in the US. So in this video I'm going to imagine what type of planet could lead to the good cops, the cops that only have their community's best interest at heart and almost never resort to police brutality or police violence. So sociologists and anthropologists and historians and other people who are much more focused on these types of issues than I am have studied police brutality and police violence and tried to analyze why there's so much more of it here in the US than there are in other parts of the world. There are objective numbers on this. For the past 7 years, for each of the past 7 years, police in the US have shot more than 1,000 people every single year. Just to compare it to something else, between 2003 and 2013, police officers in the UK shot their firearms a total of 51 times. 51 times in 10 years compared to about 10,000 here. That's a big difference. One of the things that leads to that big difference is that the US citizens, civilians in the US, just carry and own a lot of firearms. Surveys have been done to see how many firearms there are per capita in the US, and there are more civilian-owned guns in the US than there are civilians. There are about 120 guns owned per 100 people here in the US. So one of the reasons that there's so much police violence and police brutality here in the US is because they know that when they go out to deal with the community, there's a high chance that they're going to encounter someone who owns their own firearm. And so if I'm imagining a planet that doesn't have this same issue, where cops don't have to be on such high alert and always expecting to face this type of danger, it would have to be a planet that doesn't have firearms. And when I tried to imagine what planet characteristic would lead to that, I started thinking about the mechanism that actually makes firearms work. They're called firearms. You need combustion. And so I imagine that this planet for good cops would have a very high oxygen content in the atmosphere, because that would make firing a gun almost as dangerous for the person shooting it as it is for the intended target, because any type of combustion in a high oxygen environment would just be extremely dangerous and could lead to a big explosion. If you actually look at who police officers are shooting and who they're enacting violence against here in the US, it's much more likely that they're going to be violent with a black or brown person than with a white person. Black people are more than 3 times as likely to be shot by a police officer in the US than a white person is. When you look at the root causes of why black people are so much more likely to be shot than white people in the US, it's not just because they're black. If you removed black people and white people and put them together in a totally different context without a history of slavery and racism, black and white doesn't have the same connotation. It doesn't carry the same weight. And so on this planet, this mythical good cop planet, I don't want there to be a slave trade. And when I tried to think of ways that I could make that happen, I imagined that maybe the planet is just really big. If the planet is 1.5 times the size of Earth, all of the land masses are much farther apart. It's not as convenient, it's not as easy for colonization to happen and for the slave trade to get started. Third, I want to instill in these mythical good cops on this imaginary alien planet a deep respect, a deep-seated cultural respect for life. You can see this in the way that police officers in Germany are trained, where they spend so much more time on conflict management and resolution than police officers here in the US, and they're taught that a gun is the absolute last line of defense. It's the last thing they should reach for. And one of the reasons that they have this very strict and this very specific type of police officer training is because Germany has this dark history of the Nazi movement, and for a long time after World War II they were trying to turn the country around and figure out how they could get rid of these built-in types of prejudice. One of the ways they did that was by redesigning their police officer training program. And so on this planet, I want everyone to have a very deep-seated respect for life. And one way to do that is if it's just very hard to reproduce. You can imagine that if children are rare, then you're going to protect life at all costs. And even more so than it is here on Earth, killing would be incredibly taboo on this planet where it's hard to reproduce. And so I started looking at animals here on Earth that have a harder time reproducing than humans do, and I was drawn to elephants because they have this really long gestation period. Elephant pregnancies last almost 2 years, and one of the reasons for that is because it's evolutionarily advantageous for them to have longer gestation periods so that their offspring have more advanced brain development when they're born than humans do. And elephants need really developed or advanced brains when they're born so that they can understand the complex social structures of elephant herds. And also because they eat with their trunks, which is really hard to do. And so if you don't have a developed brain or a highly developed brain, you're not going to eat well. And so I think that on this planet, I want food to be hard to come across. And there are a lot of different ways that you can do that, but I wanted to have some fun with this, and so I imagine that this planet has a high obliquity. Obliquity is a term that not many people outside of planetary science are familiar with, but it's the term for the tilt of the planet's rotation axis. So you may have heard that Earth has a tilt of 23 degrees from vertical. If this planet has a tilt of almost 90 degrees, then you would have these really complicated patterns of sun exposure, where at some times of the year it's always night, and at other times of the year for months at a time it's always day, and then there are some parts of the year in between where you have normal day-night cycles depending on where you are on the planet. That one would create a system of timekeeping that's really complicated, so you'd have to have advanced brains to understand how that works, but it also means that there's not reliable sunlight, so maybe plants have a harder time growing and food is more scarce, and so you need a developed brain to actually get food enough to survive. There's a fourth thing that I think contributes to lowered amounts of police violence and brutality, and that's if you have small communities where everyone knows each other. If you can see this if you look at rural communities in the US, you can see this if you look at other countries around the world that have much less dense populations. But if people in a community all know each other, and if the police officers know everyone in their community, or if they know everyone on their beat, then they're much less likely to be violent if you have good intentions and, you know, all of those caveats. But if the species on this planet has a hard time reproducing, then they're going to have small communities anyway. So the high obliquity of the planet actually does take care of this fourth factor that would lead to lowered amounts of police violence and brutality. So this is my mythical good cop planet. It has high amounts of oxygen in the atmosphere so that it's dangerous to create and distribute firearms and fire them off. It's a very large planet so that the land masses are far apart, and it's difficult and not advantageous to create a large-scale slave trade, and it has a high obliquity, so they highly value life on this planet. I don't want this video to leave you hopeless. I don't want you to think that the only way we could possibly have an entire police force of good cops is to go to this alien planet or to completely recreate our own, which is something we can't do. This is the planet we're stuck with. We can't change it in these types of large-scale fundamental ways. But I want this video to illustrate and demonstrate that we can actually make some cultural changes here in the US that would lead to less police violence and brutality, especially against Black and brown people. Like I said before, there are sociologists and anthropologists and historians and policymakers who are much more tapped into this thing than I am. And so I am not the person to ask for how we can actually make those cultural changes, but I just wanted to make this video because I've been hurting, and I know a lot of other people are hurting, and I wanted this video to be a source of hope, maybe, to help people remember that there are places in the world and there are potentially other places in the universe where things aren't this bad. And if that's the case, then we can make things less bad here. That's the type of optimism that my job as an astrophysicist and a folklorist gives me, and I wanted to share that with you. I really hope that you got something positive out of this video. If you're looking for some of the resources that I used for the facts that I provided about police brutality and violence and training here in the US and in other parts of the world, I'm linking to those below in the description. if you like the style of this video and want others like it but without such heavy content, I release videos like this every couple of weeks where I imagine what type of planet a specific type of mythological creature could have evolved on. I hope you check those out, but if not, or until then, take care.